Lee Harvey Oswald was an enigma to most people that had ever met him. He was not overly engaging in social settings and by and large kept to himself. He held a myriad of beliefs and had studied various philosophies ranging from Marxism to socialist forms of government around the world. Once he was free of the shackles of the U.S. Marine Corps and was free to travel as he wished. He set his sights on the Soviet Union and proceeded to go through the steps he would need to accomplish to make that happen. He had been processed out of the Marine Corps quite swiftly so he could help his disabled mother, but he had no intention of doing that. Nor did he intend to attend Albert Schweitzer College, which he had sent a deposit to save him a seat in the 1958 to 1959 class. He was going to go to the Soviet Union, but how exactly would he accomplish this? On September 16, 1959, Oswald left Fort Worth on his way to New Orleans. When he arrived the next day, he went to see Lewis Hopkins Travel Consultants at the International Trade Mart. Hopkins also regularly handled travel arrangements for the head of the Trade Mart, Clay Shaw, who would go on to be tried by District Attorney Jim Garrison for alleged involvement in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, it could be just a coincidence that Oswald's travel plans were made by the same person that handled travel for Clay Shaw. After all, Hopkins was working in the same building as Shaw. But it does seem odd, and it certainly should be included in this discussion. Lewis Hopkins said that Oswald asked for the cheapest and earliest ship to Europe. He paid $220 cash for a one-way ticket to Lahore, France. On October 20th, Oswald boarded the Marion Lykes freighter, making his way across the Atlantic Ocean. The night before he left, Oswald wrote a letter to his mother where he said, quote,
"Just remember, above all else, that my values are different from Robert's or yours. It is difficult to tell you how I feel. Just remember, this is what I must do. I did not tell you about my plans because you could hardly be expected to understand."
Now, if Marguerite Oswald really told Dr. Goldberg that her son would be defecting to the Soviet Union 9 months before he did, as the FBI report says, then she should not have been surprised about him going to Russia. She would have known that this is something he was planning to do all along. Similarly, she told her landlord, Grace Craner, that Lee wouldn't be home very long, so Marguerite knew that Lee was leaving. Which is why this letter is a bit confusing, and it seems like it could be written for some other audience than Lee's mom, but maybe she was still against him going to Russia, even though she knew he was going. Maybe she didn't want him to go. In that case, the letter is much more likely to be genuine. After 18 days at sea, Oswald's ship, the Marion Lykes, docked at Le Havre, France. On October 8th, the next day, his passport says he arrived in Southampton, England. He then made the 80-mile trip to London so that he could catch a flight to Helsinki, Finland. Now, the only flight from London to Helsinki that would be consistent with the date stamps on Oswald's passport was Finnair Flight 852, which arrived in Helsinki at 11:33 p.m. on October 10th. There's a memo from Richard Helms, the CIA's Deputy Director of Plans to the Warren Commission, that says that Oswald could not have cleared customs and traveled from the airport to the hotel for him to make it to the hotel by midnight, which is when the hotel says that Oswald arrived. That memo, Commission Exhibit 2677, speculates that Oswald may have taken another route to get to Finland. That's not the only question mark around Oswald's arrival in Helsinki. His name was not found on any of the arrival lists for flights that were coming into Finland. In December of 2023, the Finnish intelligence agency, known as Supo, released declassified documents that said Oswald most likely arrived in Helsinki via Stockholm, Sweden. But there were no Swedish stamps on Oswald's passport. So, we don't know for sure how Oswald got to Finland. The fact that there's no record of him entering the country, aside from his passport stamp, does not add up. But it's also possible that Oswald didn't arrive at the hotel at midnight exactly, and someone just wrote midnight to make sure he paid for the night's stay. If so, then the flight arriving from London at 11:33 p.m. would seem to make sense. Regardless of how Oswald made it to Helsinki, things start to get more interesting once he's there. Upon arriving, he checked into Hotel Turney, a five-star hotel where presidents, royalty, and celebrities stayed when they visited. Not exactly the choice one would speculate, and ex-PFC Marine could afford to hang his hat while he was staying in Helsinki. The hotel also served as an espionage headquarters for the British and the Soviets at the end of World War II. After staying at Hotel Turney for 2 nights, Oswald checked into the Klaus Kirke Hotel for another 3 nights. Klaus Kirke was another very expensive place to stay, though not quite as fancy as the Hotel Turney. The 2 hotels were only 3 blocks apart. Oswald's hotel accommodations while in Helsinki raise a few questions. First and foremost, why was he staying in such fancy hotels, and where did he get the money for it? The Warren Commission claimed that Oswald had $1,500 in savings, but the only money that we know for sure that Oswald had was $200 from a savings account that he had just withdrawn all the funds from before leaving Texas. When Oswald arrived in the UK, he told a British immigration official that he had $700 cash in his possession. So, we don't actually know how much money Oswald had in his possession. Travelers of all stripes have certainly been known to hide cash funds from immigration officials for various reasons. Some above board, some not so much. The initial thought would be that Oswald had a lot of money in savings from his time in the military, but servicemen in Japan in the late 1950s were paid in military script, which can only be used at the base. It couldn't be converted into cash. This means that the only cash savings that Oswald had from the Marines would have been if he saved all of the $1,172 he was paid while stationed in Santa Ana, which was convertible to cash. And if he did that, it would make sense that he would have around $700 in cash left after he paid to travel from New Orleans to France, from France to the UK, and finally from the UK to Helsinki. Given that he still had to pay for the travel arrangements to make it from Helsinki to Moscow, why would Oswald burn through his limited funds staying at the most expensive hotels in Helsinki? It just doesn't make any sense. Maybe an even more important question is, why did Oswald travel to Helsinki in the first place? There were numerous other geographic locations where he could have applied for a Soviet visa and traveled to Russia. We know that Oswald had Finland in mind from the time he submitted his passport application, because the application mentions possibly attending the University of Turku in addition to Albert Schweitzer College. Oswald applied for a visa to the Soviet consulate in Helsinki on October 13th. His visa was issued 1 day later on October 14th. Within 1 day. That seems like a very fast timeline to get a visa. But was it? According to former KGB agent Yuri Nasenko, the timing of Oswald's visa was standard. There was no reason for the USSR to not grant the visa since Oswald was only 19 years old, and he didn't list his Marine service on the application. He just said that he was a student traveling. On the other hand, the CIA made calls to the Soviet embassy in Helsinki after the assassination in an attempt to find out how long it took to get a visa to Russia from Helsinki. They were told that if the applicant applied in person, the normal visa process took 5 to 7 days, but that it was, quote, impossible within 2 or 3 days to get a visa. According to a declassified July 10, 1964 CIA memo, Oswald said that he planned to stay at the Hotel Turney for 5 days when he checked in. We know that Oswald did in fact end up staying in Helsinki for exactly 5 days. Now, how he could have known that beforehand is a bit of a mystery. He did end up switching hotels halfway through his overall stay in Helsinki for reasons that are unknown, but he was able to forecast with precision exactly how long it would take him to get a visa to the Soviet Union. A lucky guess on his part, perhaps, although this reporter thinks not. Another declassified document sheds even more light on why Oswald would have chosen Helsinki as his entrance point into the Soviet Union. The document says that during a lunch conversation with Gregory Golub, the Soviet consulate in Helsinki, Golub told his American State Department counterpart, quote, Moscow had given him the authority to give Americans visas without prior approval from Moscow. Golub stated that this would make his job much easier, and as long as he was convinced that the American was all right, he would give him a visa in a matter of minutes. This conversation took place on July 17, 1959, just a few months before Oswald went to Helsinki. To put this into context, in every other European capital, Soviet visa applications were required to be sent to Moscow for approval. But in Helsinki, and Helsinki alone, this process could be bypassed by the person giving out the visas. This procedure made Helsinki a very attractive entry point destination for anyone who wanted to get to the Soviet Union quickly. And it is rumored that all of the other ex-military personnel that defected to Russia during this time, and there were several. Oswald was not alone in this venture. Intelligence organizations like the ONI, or Office of Naval Intelligence, and it should be noted that the Marine Corps is the boots-on-the-ground backbone of the Navy, as well as the CIA. They all had programs in place to get boots-on-the-ground intelligence within Russia at the time. I just thought it important to point that out. Now, this conversation with Golub was by no means common public knowledge, but one can speculate that if different departments or agencies had programs in place to get first-hand intel, maybe the meat of that conversation made its way to the ears of the people that would want to know about this little-known policy at the consulate in Helsinki. There is also another State Department dispatch talking about how two Americans who wanted to quickly apply for Soviet visas in Helsinki were told to go directly to Gregory Golub at the Soviet embassy. Golub told those Americans that he would approve their travel visa as soon as they made advanced reservations with the Soviet Travel Bureau. This State Department dispatch about how easy it was for two Americans to get into the Soviet Union quickly through Helsinki was sent on October 9, 1959, just one day before Oswald arrived in Helsinki. So, Oswald was able to afford the fanciest hotels in Helsinki, even though he was broke. He stayed there for 5 days, which is exactly how long he said he would be there, and he had his visa for entry into Russia approved nearly immediately at the only location in the world where you could accomplish this. Either Oswald was getting help from some unseen hand, or he was incredibly lucky. Now, I'm not a betting man, but I'd wager toward the unseen hand. Before 1958, it was rare for Americans to defect to Russia. From the end of World War II to 1959, a period of about 14 years, there were only 2 defectors from the United States to the Soviet Union. Those numbers suddenly rose over an 18-month period in 1959 and 1960, when there were 9 defectors to the Soviet Union. In 1959, the year Oswald would attempt to defect, there were 2 other Americans who had already defected before him, Nicholas Petrulli and Robert Webster. Not much is known about Petrulli, but Robert Webster is potentially a very interesting character. Webster was a plastics expert who worked for Rand Development at the time of his defection. The company was founded by Henry Rand, who worked with the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, during World War II. It should be noted that the OSS was the precursor to the CIA. George Bookbinder, who was a top executive at Rand Development, also worked for the OSS, and he reported directly to Frank Wisner, who was one of the founders of the CIA. On top of all of that, Christopher Byrd, who was working for the CIA at the time, served as the Washington, D.C. representative of Rand Development in the 1950s. In other words, there are clear connections between Rand Development Corporation and the CIA at the time when Robert Webster defected to the Soviet Union. Now, that doesn't prove that the CIA used Rand Development or that Robert Webster was a CIA plant or agent. But the guy sure looks like Daniel Craig, who played James Bond in the last incarnation of the franchise. I'm just saying. Webster went to Russia in 1959 on behalf of Rand to promote products at a trade show in Moscow. It was during this trip to Russia that Webster defected. When he went to the Office of Soviet Visas and Registration to defect, Webster was accompanied by Henry Rand and George Bookbinder, as well as the U.S. Embassy Counsel, Richard Snyder. That occurrence begs the question, why would the top two executives of an American company with intelligence connections and the head of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow personally help Robert Webster defect to Russia? It looks like either Webster's two bosses and the American council wanted to make sure that Webster was able to live out his dreams of Soviet defection, or they wanted to make sure he defected for other reasons. What is especially strange about Robert Webster is what he told author Dick Russell about meeting a 17-year-old Russian girl at a trade show in Moscow. Her name was Marina Prusakova, the same woman who would go on to marry Lee Harvey Oswald and move to the United States. Marina would have no reason to be at this trade show. She was from Leningrad, which was not near Moscow. Webster said that she spoke to him in English, but with a heavy accent. According to the Warren report, Marina couldn't speak any English at all when she arrived in the United States. Incidentally, the Soviet government placed Webster in Marina's hometown of Leningrad when he defected. Webster lived in the Soviet Union for 2 years, married a Russian woman and had a child with her, and then ended up coming back to America in 1962, leaving his wife and child behind in Russia. If what Webster said about meeting Marina Oswald is true, it looks as though Marina could have been a KGB asset of some sort, given that she could speak English and she was going out of her way to talk to an American who was defecting. Kind of sounds like a classic honeypot situation to me. We'll come back to Robert Webster later, but for now we'll move on to more info surrounding Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald arrived in Moscow on October 16, 1959. He was taken to his hotel that night by his tour guide, Rema Cherikova, who was a KGB informant, like everyone else who worked for Intourist, the state bureau that had a monopoly on foreign travelers inside of Russia. His travel visa allowed him to stay in Russia for 6 days. On the second day of his tour, Oswald told Cherikova that he wanted to defect to the Soviet Union. On the third day of his tour, October 18, 1959, Oswald's 20th birthday, Cherikova told her KGB contact that Oswald wanted to defect. The contact then requested that Cherikova help Oswald. So she helped Oswald in writing a letter to the Supreme Soviet formally requesting Soviet citizenship. Cherikova also gave Oswald a Russian literature classic as a gift, a copy of Dostoevsky's The Idiot. While he was in Russia, Oswald kept a diary, which is the source of much of what we know about his time there. This diary was authenticated as being in Oswald's handwriting by the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. As you will see, some critics of the official version dispute the diary's accuracy and authenticity. Oswald's diary entry of October 21st is of particular importance. That's the day when Oswald was called to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was told that his request for Russian citizenship had been denied, and that he must leave Moscow in the next 2 hours. His diary says, quote, "I am stunned. Evening 6 p.m. Received word from police official I must leave country tonight at 8 p.m. as visa expires. I am shocked. My dreams. I retired to my room. I have $100 left. I waited for 2 years to be accepted. My fondest dreams are shattered because of a petty official, because of bad planning. I planned too much. 7 p.m. I decide to end it. Soak wrist in cold water to numb the pain, then slash my left wrist. I think when Rama comes at 8 to find me dead, it will be a great shock. Somewhere a violin plays as I watch my life whirl away. I think to myself how easy to die and a sweet death to violins." So, according to Oswald's diary, he found out that his visa was denied at around 6 p.m. He decided to take his own life at 7 p.m., and he planned to be dead by 8. Luckily for us, we have more information about this harrowing saga in the form of interviews that author Norman Mailer did with Rema Cherikova. Cherikova said that when she met Oswald, he had just arrived by train in the deluxe class, which was the most expensive class, usually reserved for only very wealthy people. Oswald's entire tour in Russia with Intourist was booked as deluxe class. She said that Oswald only spoke English and didn't seem to know a single word of Russian. But Chirikova's statement about the timeline of Oswald's attempted suicide seems quite far off from Oswald's diary. She says that she arrived at his hotel at 2 o'clock and then waited for about 30 minutes before she got help to open Oswald's door. When the door was finally forced open by hotel security, the security guards who entered the room found Oswald in the bathroom. Chirikova didn't see if Oswald was on the floor or in the tub, but she did see him come out of the bathroom on a stretcher, unconscious but wearing dry clothes. According to the Russian doctor who worked on him, Oswald was taken to the Botkinskaya hospital at 4 o'clock. The cut on Oswald's left wrist was 3 to 5 centimeters long and took 4 stitches to repair. Dr. Lydia Mikulina, a psychiatrist at Botkinskaya Hospital, described Oswald's injury as, quote, a show suicide since he was refused political asylum, which he had been demanding. It looks like Oswald's attempt at suicide shows that he was just very desperate to remain in the Soviet Union, not that he actually intended to take his own life. On the other hand, Gerald Posner presents a very different picture. He relies on statements from the former KGB agent we mentioned earlier, Yuri Nashchenko, who began providing secrets to the CIA in Geneva, Switzerland in 1961. Nashchenko claims that he was the KGB agent responsible for overseeing Oswald in Russia. The CIA had mixed feelings on whether Nashchenko could be trusted and worried that he was providing false information because he was a Russian disinformation agent. Nashchenko told the CIA that Oswald was not a KGB agent, but the CIA still put Nashchenko in solitary confinement for 1,277 days, until he was eventually released and given a false identity and a new job with the CIA. When it comes to the suicide attempt, Nashchenko says that Oswald's injury was serious enough that it required medical intervention in the form of blood transfusions. He also says that the KGB decided not to pursue Oswald as an agent because they thought he was mentally unstable. The reason that they didn't immediately send him home is because they wanted to avoid the optics of an American student being manhandled by the big bad Russians. So instead, they decided to keep an eye on him to make sure he didn't cause any trouble, and he wasn't an American sleeper agent. So, once again, we have conflicting evidence. It appears as though the attempted suicide was a cry for help, to allow Oswald to stay in Moscow. If you believe Nashchenko and avoid Chirikova, the Botkinskaya doctor, and Dr. Mikulina, you could disagree and say it was a bona fide suicide attempt. The reason it matters is that it speaks to whether Oswald was mentally stable. If he really attempted suicide, you could say he was mentally unstable. If it was a ruse, it shows that he desperately wanted to stay in Russia no matter what the cost. The question is, why exactly would Oswald want to stay in Russia no matter what the cost? This and other questions will be examined thoroughly as we look further into more of Oswald's time in Russia. That will be contained in future episodes. For now, we will conclude this first part of Oswald's time in Russia.